In a prior video, we looked at some of the most prominent father and son duos in wrestling, names like Dusty and Cody Rhodes, Rocky and Dwayne Johnson, or the Orton family. But what are some of the more underrated and obscure examples of father-son duos in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Haku and his children, the Gorillas of Destiny. Yes, as legend goes, there has never been a tougher man in the history of the wrestling industry than Haku, and this led to him finding success in pretty much every territory he worked in throughout his in-ring career, whether that be WWF, WCW, or even in Japan. That said, for as much success as he had out east, he was arguably outshone by his children Tama Tonga and Tonga Loa in that respect, as not long after they made their debuts in Japan, they'd find themselves going on to huge levels of success as not only longtime members of the Bullet Club, but also as 7-time IWGP Tag Team Champions. And that's not all Tama Tonga and Tonga Loa have been doing with their careers either. No, since saying goodbye to New Japan in early 2024, they found themselves moving over to WWE, where they've become members of Solo Sikoa's new incarnation of the Bloodline, with this making them a key part of the hottest angle in all of wrestling today. Hell, being a part of this angle has already allowed them to become one-time WWE Tag Team Champions. Of course, in doing so, they followed in the footsteps of their father, as he himself was once a WWF Tag Team Champion alongside Andre the Giant, albeit briefly. So there must be a family thing about being a successful duos act. But what about the real wildcard of the Bloodline 2.0? The Samoan werewolf Jacob Fatu, the son of the Tonga Kid. Now, in the lineage of great members of the Anoa'i family, the Tonga Kid might not be quite as celebrated as people like The Rock, Roman Reigns, or Yokozuna, but that shouldn't suggest that he isn't great in his own way. After all, he was a key part of WWF's tag team division throughout the 80s when he was paired up with Haku to become one half of the Islanders. And while it could be argued that Ming was always the bigger star of the duo, the Tonga Kid more than carried his weight whenever he was asked to do so. So when his time with WWF ultimately came to an end in 1998 and he had to move on to other places, he had no problem finding work in companies like WCW and Puerto Rico's World Wrestling Council. In fact, it was while working down in Atlanta that the San Francisco native briefly struck gold again when he became a member of the Samoan SWAT team alongside names such as Rikishi and Yokozuna. That said, for all the success the Tonga Kid had during his run, it would be easy to make the claim that his son has already outshone him at just 32 years old. Why is this? Well, because to put it simply, Jacob Fatu is one of the best young wrestlers in the world today. And that's something he's been proving ever since his early days in Major League Wrestling, the place where he became a one-time MLW World Heavyweight Champion and one-time MLW National Openweight Champion. Seriously, if you were to look at people who have the best chance of becoming a major face of the industry in years to come, then the Samoan werewolf would have to be in your eye line. And this has continued right up to his current run in WWE where, serving as the role of the enforcer for the new Bloodline, he's been excellent every time he's appeared on screen, with him outshining the other members of the group on a regular basis. Does this mean Jacob will be leading the Bloodline himself one day? It's entirely possible. And if he does, that will only add to the case that he's exceeded his father in terms of accomplishments in the ring. But what about AEW? Surely they have their own roster of second-generation talents too? Well, yes they do. And two of them are our next subjects as it happens, the Gunns and their father, Billy Gunn. Now, you don't need us to tell you who Billy Gunn is. After all, if you were a fan of wrestling back during the Attitude Era, then you would have no doubt enjoyed watching him appear on Raw and SmackDown every week as a member of D-Generation X, with him usually causing some chaos alongside his New Age Outlaws tag team partner, the Road Dogg. And then, of course, there was all the success he had after his time in WWE came to an end, and he was forced to make a living in other places like TNA for a while. Even today, in fact, Billy remains relevant, perhaps more relevant than ever, and that's because he's currently playing the role of Daddy Ass, the third member of the Acclaimed down in AEW. But he wasn't always the third member of the Acclaimed in Jacksonville. No, prior to that, he was helping to get his sons, Austin and Colton Gunn, moving up the ranks. As time went on though, Austin and Colton decided they no longer needed their father's help, and to be fair to them, maybe they didn't, as not long after their estrangement from their dad, they'd shocked the world by becoming AEW World Tag Team Champions. And it's not like they've slowed down since losing those belts to FTR in April of 2023 either. No, they've arguably gone on to greater heights since then, as they've joined forces with Switchblade Jay White and Juice Robinson to form the Bang Bang Gang, All Elite Wrestling's satellite branch of the Bullet Club, a partnership which has seen them become one-time trios champions too. Will there be more gold in their future? Well, if the path their father went down in his career is any representation of where they're headed, almost certainly. In fact, we wouldn't be surprised to see Austin and Colton go off on their separate paths at some point and win some singles gold. That said, if this does happen, we see them coming back together as a duo eventually, as they work so well that way, just the same way as Billy Gunn always excelled in the tag team division. Who knows? By the time all is said and done, maybe all three of the Gunns will reunite. Because as we said a moment ago, Billy Gunn is still very much an active member of the AEW roster. Hell, he himself is a former Trios champion, so never say never, as there's plenty of story left to tell in the father-son rivalry that is the Gunn family. One family we're probably not going to see reuniting in a match anytime soon though is another one which currently falls under the AEW banner. Who are we talking about here? Why, World-Class Championship Wrestling legend Kevin Von Erich and his two sons, two-thirds of the current Ring of Honor six-man tag team champions, Ross and Marshall Von Erich. That's right, if you're a fan of wrestling history, or you just happened to catch the Iron Claw in cinemas last year, then you'll be all too aware of the tragedy that is the Von Erich family. 6 brothers, one of whom passed away as a child and 4 of whom passed away when they were in their 20s and 30s. But as tragic as this story is, for the years they were around, the Von Erichs were some of the biggest stars of the territory era, true rock stars in their home state of Texas during the early to mid-80s. And, on a positive note, Kevin Von Erich has continued to live a happy life post-retirement. Yes, while he had to suffer a lot of loss during his lifetime, Kevin, himself a 5-time NWA American Heavyweight Champion, 4-time NWA American Tag Team Champion, and 7-time NWA 6-Man Tag Team Champion, would eventually find peace with his wife Pam and his 4 children. And of these 4 children, 2 of them, namely Ross and Marshall, would eventually decide that they wanted to enter the world of wrestling themselves. How would this work out for them? Pretty well so far, because since debuting in 2012, they've been able to work their way up the ranks of the indies, appearing in the likes of TNA and MLW, all before eventually signing contracts with Ring of Honor. Sure, they've occasionally appeared on shows like AEW Collision and Rampage, but for the most part, ROH has been Ross and Marshall's home, and it's there they've recently found title success by becoming 6-man tag team champions alongside fellow Texas wrestling legend Dustin Rhodes. What does this spell for their future? Well, with the next year's All In event set to take place in Arlington, Texas, we feel pretty confident in saying they'll have a nice spot on this show, with this perhaps being the point they get their main roster AEW call-up, so to speak. And given how beloved he remains in Texas today, we also wouldn't be surprised to see Kevin Von Erich make an appearance here too. Not in a match necessarily, but at least to stand in the corner of his boys and cheer them on to victory as they keep the Von Erich name alive for the next generation. Yes, those old territory days still hold a warm place in the hearts of many wrestling fans, and it's for that reason one of our next subjects remains so beloved himself. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Terry Gordy and his son Ray Gordy. Yes, if you were someone who grew up watching that old Southern style of territory wrestling in places like World-Class Championship Wrestling, Georgia Championship Wrestling, or Jim Crockett Promotions, then you probably loved Terry Gordy back in the day, as he was pretty much the personification of a tough fighting brawler. And that's what made him such a great addition to the legendary trio the Fabulous Freebirds then, with it being in this group that he'd become a tag team and trios champion too many times to count throughout the 80s. Hell, even when he headed out east, Terry Gordy was a big success, as his run in All Japan during the 90s era proves. Yes, it was there he'd not only become a 2-time Triple Crown champion, but also a 7-time World Tag Team champion with partners Dr. Death Steve Williams and Stan the Lariat Hansen. Sadly though, much like many other wrestlers of his generation, Terry Gordy would pass away all too young at just 40 years old in 2001. But not all was lost for the Gordy family at that point, because while Terry might have been gone and the industry was missing a true legend as a result of this, his son Ray would continue to carry the flag, as it was in 2000 that he'd start his own in-ring career. And while this in-ring career never saw him reach quite the same heights as his father had, he still managed to make a name for himself in his own right. How would this be? Well, most notably by getting a job with WWE in 2005, and there proceeding to have a 5-year-long run. That's right, this was the point that fans were first introduced to Jesse, the tag team partner of Festus, an earlier incarnation of Luke Gallows. No, it wasn't exactly a main event act, but it did allow Ray to keep his family's name alive in the public eye, as he was a semi-regular fixture on SmackDown back then. And even once the Jesse gimmick ran its course, he'd continue to be a semi-regular fixture on the Blue brand by changing things up and transforming into Slam Master Jay, a wannabe rapper in the vein of the Doctor of Thugonomics era John Cena. What has Ray Gordy been doing since his time playing Slam Master Jay? Not a huge amount in terms of wrestling, as after retiring in 2010, he's moved on to a new career as a police officer in Atlanta. But that doesn't mean he hasn't been able to return to WWE for a cameo appearance, with this being something he did in 2016 when his father was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame alongside his fabulous Freebirds teammates Michael Hayes, Buddy Roberts, and Jimmy Garvin. But let's move away from the stars of WCCW for now and onto a legend of another old territory, specifically Memphis. Yes, it's time for us to talk about the great Jerry the King Lawler and his son, Brian Christopher. Yes, it was during the 70s and 80s when the King was the booker and top star of the Continental Wrestling Association, and on top of this, one of the most famous people in the entire city of Memphis. So famous that he could get away with calling himself the King, even though he lived in the same place as Elvis Presley. And using this fame then, Lawler was able to stay right at the top of the card for most of his career down in Tennessee, with him becoming an NWA Southern Heavyweight Champion a total of 58 times during this period. And then of course there's his run with WWF, which began during the 90s, a run which introduced him to an even wider audience. This was the one that saw him memorably feud with Bret Hitman Hart, all while he was also serving as a commentator and one of the key voices of the Attitude Era. In fact, for many fans now, Jerry Lawler is a commentator first and a wrestler second, but then that's understandable considering the Attitude Era was the most successful mainstream period in wrestling history. And as it happens, this is also the period where Jerry's son, Brian Christopher, first rose to prominence, though many fans may not have known that they were related at the time. Why was that? Well, apparently wanting to make his own way and not rely on his family name, Brian Christopher chose not to tell the fans he was the son of the King. Sure, there would be plenty of sly references made on commentary for those in the know, and after a while it would become common knowledge, but at least initially, all most fans knew was that this was a young and up-and-coming rookie. Not that Christopher would stay a rookie for long though. No, he'd quickly become a star in his own right, with him becoming one-third of Too Cool, one of the most over acts of the entire run of the Millennium period, alongside Scotty 2 Hotty and Rikishi. Yes, it was while a member of Too Cool that Brian Christopher, or Grandmaster Sexay as he was then known, would reach his apex by becoming a one-time WWF Tag Team Champion. Sadly though, his time would ultimately be cut short, as it would be in 2018 that he'd pass away at just 46 years old, with his father continuing to keep his memory alive to this day. Gladfully though, when it comes to our next subjects, they're both still around. And that's great news for wrestling fans everywhere, as they make up the legendary Steamboat family of Ricky and Richie Steamboat. Of course, Ricky Steamboat's resume speaks for itself, as he's quite simply one of the best wrestlers to ever lace up a pair of boots. Seriously, during the 80s, it was a very short list of people who could match up to him in the ring, and none of them could do that trademark deep arm drag anywhere near as good as he could. So it should go without saying then that wherever he was working, whether it be Jim Crockett Promotions, Championship Wrestling from Florida, WWF, or anywhere else, he was beloved by fans and usually decorated in gold by the time his run was over. And when we say beloved, we mean beloved, because there was quite possibly never a better babyface to do it than the Dragon. Hell, he's the only example we can come up with when we think of prominent wrestlers who never once turned heel throughout the entirety of their careers. But then, how could you turn Ricky Steamboat heel when he was the ultimate good guy, a family man of such positive reputation that it was impossible to boo him? No, the reality was there was never any danger of Steamboat going to the dark side, and that's exactly why, when he finally retired from full-time in-ring competition in 1994, he'd still be a hero to fans everywhere. Could the same thing be said about his son Richie when he got his start in the industry sometime after this in 2008? Well, yes, actually. That said, when it came to the son of the Dragon, his career wouldn't be anywhere near as lengthy or storied, unfortunately. No, despite making a strong start as a rookie when he was signed to a contract with WWE in 2009, he'd end up being forced to retire just 4 years later when an injury meant he'd never be cleared to wrestle again. But that shouldn't suggest Richie Steamboat didn't do anything during his short run. No, while he might never have become a world champion like his father, and while he might not have reached the bright lights of Raw or SmackDown, he did show a lot of potential while in the developmental brands Florida Championship Wrestling and NXT. And this would be enough to see him become a former FCW Florida Heavyweight Champion and FCW Florida Tag Team Champion alongside Seth Rollins. So it's clear there was a lot of potential within him to be a much bigger deal than he became. But then we guess that's just a testament to the Steamboat lineage and its ability to produce great wrestlers. But what about our next duo, the Hall family, namely Scott Hall and his son Cody? That's right, we're going back to the 90s, as that was the period when Scott Hall first rose to prominence in the world of wrestling, initially as a member of the WWF roster under the gimmick of Razor Ramon. And while this would lead to a lot of success for him in the form of 4 Intercontinental title wins, he didn't really reach that true superstar level until 1996, as that was the point he jumped ship to WCW and became a founding member of the NWO. Of course, what the New World Order would go on to do would be nothing less than to rewrite the very rulebook of the industry, and all the while they were doing so, Hall was right there near the forefront, being the coolest guy on TV each and every week. Sure, he never became world champion, but he still had a hell of a run, and this was enough to make him worthy of being a Hall of Famer in anybody's book. As you can probably guess though, by the time the early 2000s came around, the bad guy's time in the sun was coming to a quick end, as with him not being able to be relied on by promoters anymore, he found himself largely disappearing from view, and in the end, that left the door open for his son Cody to eventually come along in 2012 and try to carry on his family's legacy instead, with him doing this not in the United States like his father did, but out east in Japan. Yes, instead of becoming a star somewhere like WWE or even TNA, Cody Hall ventured over to the land of the rising sun, where he worked for companies like New Japan, Pro Wrestling Noah, and DDT, there becoming an official member of the Bullet Club. Sure, he never became as big of a star as his dad in doing this, but he still had a solid run for himself, enough to where the Hall name would continue on in fans' minds for a little while longer. And so when Scott Hall passed away in 2022, the wrestling world still had a family member in the industry. What is Cody Hall doing now in 2024? Well, due to a neck injury he picked up while wrestling for DDT in 2020, he'd be forced to retire from in-ring action. But what about our next subjects, that of Bull Buchanan and Brooks Jensen? That's right, Bull Buchanan carved out a nice spot for himself in the WWF during the Attitude and Ruthless Aggression eras, as while fans were getting warmed up to watch the likes of Stone Cold Steve Austin or Triple H back in the day, it would be up to guys like Bull to get them into the early proceedings of the show. And this led to him doing things like becoming a member of the Right to Censor, or even at one point turning into the lackey of Doctor of Thuganomics era John Cena when he renamed himself to B2. Did this equate to much in the way of title success for Buchanan? Well, yes, as he was a tag team champion with the Good Father. So it would be years later in 2021 when Bull's son, Brooks Jensen, would sign up with NXT and quickly making a splash as part of his tag team with Josh Briggs. Hell, the two would impress so much during their early days on the developmental brand, they'd become NXT United Kingdom Tag Team Champions at one point, with this meaning that, while still in the rookie part of his career, Brooks Jensen would be able to say he's matched his father when it came to title success. Where has he gone since then? Well, with the tag team he had with Josh Briggs having sadly ended in 2023, it's meant the son of Bull Buchanan has went on his own, with his current character attempting to build off the work of people like Brian Pillman. How is he similar to Pillman in what he's doing these days? Well, after splitting with Briggs, Jensen apparently quit WWE and began going off at Shawn Michaels on social media, with this work-shoot situation later seeing him turn into something of a loose cannon once he was officially brought back into the fold in NXT, with him now teaming up with Shawn Spears. Yes, it looks like the future is bright for Brooks Jensen as, with the character he has now, the sky's the limit on how far he can go should HBK decide to give him that big push to the moon. Unfortunately though, not every son of a WWE legend can reach that level. No, some have sadly gone forgotten for the most part, as was the case with Sim Snuka, the son of Superfly Jimmy Snuka. And back in the day, Jimmy was a huge star. In fact, there was a period there during the pre-Hulkamania days of WWF that he was arguably the company's top babyface, even more so than their world champion Bob Backlund. Hell, that scene of him facing off against Don Morocco inside of a steel cage and leaping from the top of the structure at the end of the bout has become such an essential piece of WWE canon over the years, it's still highlighted as one of their most iconic moments, even today. Sure, once Hulk Hogan came in like a force of nature, it's true that Snuka's star power waned somewhat as he became more of an upper mid-card act than anything else, but he remains one of the biggest stars of the pre-Vince McMahon Jr. era of WWF regardless. Could the same legendary status be given to his son Sim, however? Well, no, not really. He was never quite on that level, but that doesn't mean he didn't also have a nice run for himself in the WWE throughout the mid to late 2000s. Yes, it was back then that he'd first be introduced to fans, though not in the way you might have expected, as rather than being sold here as the son of the legendary Superfly, the Fiji native would be brought in as Deuce, one half of the throwback 50s greaser tag team Deuce and Domino. And this team would have a nice run as they would go on to become tag team champions. And after this, in 2008, things would change somewhat, as it was then Sim got an opportunity to be repackaged under his real name. Why was this? Well, because it was the period that Randy Orton was starting the Legacy, a stable made up of second and third generation superstars. Sure, Sim Snuka didn't hang around this stable for long, but he was there for a while at least, and it allowed him to embrace his heritage as a member of the Snuka family. And that makes him a perfect example of a great part of a father-son wrestling duo, just like everyone else we've looked at today.